Just quick background to who I am, who Sandra is, what we do, just for context. I manage the service within the council, which is around our sort of performance intelligence and research work. We work across all areas of the council. We're a centralised resource and provide that performance and analytics capabilities to a whole range of things. So, just thinking about this week, we've leaped from work on climate and zero carbon to cost of living to school numbers to health to waste collection, a whole range of things that we're involved in. I've got a team of about 80 sort of analysts, data people, report writers, coders, social researchers, etc. that come together to do that work. So one of the things that we were asked to do earlier this year was to think about the impending, or now here, cost of living crisis, and how did we try and understand much more about our residents and the impact, and try and get ahead in our planning around what responses might look like. So the analytics that I just wanted to run through here aren't the most sophisticated in the world. They're quite basic in a sense, that we've just put together various data sets to try and paint a picture, but it's given us quite a clear narrative to work through with all of our stakeholders internally and externally around this is the scale of the challenge, this is what it feels like on the ground for our residents, and therefore how do we come together and work in different ways. The stuff that's in here is quite sensitive, so anybody watching this back on the video, I would just say just respect the fact that this isn't scaremongering. This is about us trying to understand where we're at. So it paints a picture for Manchester, but that picture is representative of the whole country in many ways, and we've used it in that way. But happy to talk to people outside of this around any of the details and the sort of do's and don'ts within the pack. The other thing then linked to that is that I thought it was useful to sort of come back to Doug here to get a sort of, I suppose, a non-public sector perspective on this. Most of our stakeholders that we've engaged with have been public sector organisations or voluntary sector and some local establishments, but nothing on the broader scale that Doug members give. So I'd quite like to sort of get to the end of this and think about if there are areas where we're missing bits of data or evidence or insight that you're aware of that you think we should be factoring into our local picture, whether there are opportunities to think about different responses where, we've got the same challenge as you in some ways, and actually how do we join up our resources and our ways of working to be able to do that. So really this was just to share what we've done, have a bit of a conversation around how it might or may not be useful to all of you, and then think about whether there's any further steps that we might want to take on the back of it. So there's quite a big slide pack in here and we can share it. I'm not going to go through it all in detail, and I'll sort of try to whistle through most of the headlines quite quickly. But the first slide, none of this will be a surprise to anybody who watches the news on a daily basis, but sort of national context is the combination of Brexit, COVID. We're already putting pressures on UK economy and personal household budgets. All of the cost of living stuff that's surfaced in the last 12 months or so has then just compounded that and added to a problem that was already there, and just made that bigger. In terms of support, again, most of you will be aware of this. The national support to try and mitigate some of this is around sort of 650 cost of living payments to the most vulnerable, £400 energy discount for all, £300 for pensioners, £150 for those claiming disability benefits, and there is some support through things like the Housing Support Fund, which is to sort of target additional discretionary funds on vulnerable households. But the key point at the bottom of that none of this goes far enough to mitigate the problem completely. It helps, but it isn't all the solution. But I guess you all know that already. Some of the key figures, again, I'm sure you're reporting on these already within your organisations, and this is a little bit out of date now because this was done a few weeks ago and it seems to change hourly. But, inflation, massive issue, real growth, growth in real wages declining, base rates increasing significantly above where we have got there. Low wages overall within Manchester, big energy price leaps, lots of universal credit claimants, and then for those that rely on childcare, live in private rented sector properties, additional burdens and risks around those as those industries have to increase their prices as well. But poverty is not a new thing in Manchester. We are quite a deprived city in many ways, and we've got some, I suppose, extremes in that we've got, some very affluent and exciting and growth areas, certainly around our city centre and some of the suburbs to the south. But we've also got some acute areas of deprivation around the north and east and very south of the city. So we've been doing a lot of work over, forever, in a sense, to try and reconcile that. So it's not necessarily new for us, but this is a different type of challenge that brings the challenge of, I suppose, poverty and cost of living to a much bigger number than maybe we've seen previously. So we've done some analysis in the city, and I say we, Kasia, who's on the call, has done most of this work with her team. I'm just the face of this for today. And we've looked at sort of commercially available data to try and look at where discretionary income sits with our residents. And the first, slightly frightening statistic is that there are around about 40,000 households where they have less than £30 a month after they've paid all essential bills and costs, living costs. So the equivalent of about £360 a year that is the totality of what they've got to spend on anything else. The mapping shows that they're clustered in those areas where we know deprivation has been entrenched for quite a while, around the north and the east and in the very south of the city. And we can put some numbers around that now to try and say the scale of the problem is, 4,000 households up in that Harper Hay ward up in the north, and not that few more in the other ward wards that we've got there. We've then done some academic sort of lit review type work to look at who's been profiling the cost of living implications for households. The most relevant we found at the time of this research was the work done by Loughborough University, which was trying to profile the increase on all those factors that I showed earlier in terms of inflation, food costs, fuel costs, etc. within there. And they put an estimate earlier in the summer of about £2,000 per year being the extra costs for the typical household. We now know that that's much higher than that, but we're working through the update on the analytics at the minute. If we apply that to these families that have basically only got a £360 per year available additional resource, £2,000 extra cost puts them into negative straight away. The one-off mitigations from government equate to about £1,200 in total for these households, because they will get the payment that's going to the lowest income families plus the universal support that everyone else is getting. But what this means is that these families will still find themselves £560 per year or £43 per month negative. So they cannot cover costs. So this is a real crisis for these families, and will find themselves into some fairly desperate measures as we work through. And as I say, the numbers are slightly terrifying in that we think that that's about 20% of all our households, about 40,000 people, 40,000 households, in the city. We then expanded the work out to look at those that had a little bit more discretionary income. So those that we felt would start to be pulled into this if things got worse. So these are households who've typically got about £30 to £124 per month discretionary income. Again, if you apply the same logic, the increased costs are around £2,000 per year. The fact that they won't get the full package of support from government because they are above the base low income threshold, so they won't get the £650 that very low income households will get. So they'll get a total of about £550 benefit. around that. These families at the time of doing this work, I suppose, would just about cope in many ways. So it would wipe out all of their available discretionary income. And for some, it would take them into negative because obviously the scaling within there. As I said before, what we know is that £2,000 is likely to be more like 2.5, if not more. So these have now been pulled into the same category as the group we've just looked at before. This is the further 60,000 households that could find themselves in this position. So, scale is immense. And as I said at the start, this is not a great pack to talk about. The third area that we looked at was the issue around private rented sector. So we know that private rented prices have been increasing in the city anyway, as supply and demand has just drove rental up. For many years, that was a really good thing because that showed a buoyant and strengthening market. Right now, it's not. And, in many ways, those rises will still have to continue, particularly as mortgage rates increase and put additional pressures on landlords that will then be passed on to tenants within there. So this is a subset of that 100,000, and we think about 14,000 households in the private rented sector are going to have some really serious challenges with meeting their rents each year, and we think that probably means that they'll be about £63 a month short of meeting those requirements. It's not universal across the board, as you'll know. This was just again an illustration that helps us understand the fact that if you are single, you will see the lowest total amount impact. If you're a larger family with more children, obviously bigger because your costs overall are higher. And it's just really to say that it's disproportionate, and the bit of work that we may move into is to try and profile a bit more around household type rather than area. So the work on the slides before is very geographic to say on average we think households are like this, whereas this approach would start to say if you're a single resident living in this part of the city, you may feel it like this. If your next door neighbour's a household of 2 adults and 5 children, that's a very different picture for them. So we do recognise that there's a lot of difference and variance within this. We've profiled it just outside of Manchester as well. So Manchester's got quite a concentration around this, but it's not just a Manchester issue, it's a greater Manchester issue, but it's also a national issue. So in many ways we're no different to anywhere else. But we've just done this analysis to make sure that we can inform our stakeholders on where we're at. We've tried to add some additional context to those areas. So on those first few maps, we've identified 11 areas in the city where we think that the risks are most concentrated or most high, or are the highest. And for those areas, we've then tried to profile more about the families and the households that live there. So we've looked at household composition, income, we've looked at population, demographics, housing profile, employment status. We've looked at things like community assets and I suppose the things that may offset some of the risks within a local area. And we've tried to look at housing type and started to look at whether there are fuel cost implications of some of that if you're in particular types of accommodation that are more or less efficient, for example. A couple of examples of that output then told us about, this is not one homogenous group. We're not just saying there are 100,000 families that are at risk and they need this type of support. There are lots of differences. This example in the Miles Platting ward, what we saw here is in this area, this is predominantly families with children who live in social housing accommodation who are generally more reliant on benefit. So this is the unemployed challenge area, but they've got support networks through social landlords and other things, and this is one cohort. What we see in a different part of the city, and this is Levenshulme, is a complete inverse of this. So this is an area where there are far more singles living in private rented accommodation, working in low paid jobs. So very different set of characteristics, or some of the protective factors for these don't exist in the housing sense, but may exist in the employment sense, and trying to work through that. And we've done this type of profiling and analytics across the 11 hotspots that we've got. I won't run through these slides here. I'll just flick through them very quickly. But this is an example of one of the full ward profiles that we've got. So we've tried to profile each area and compare each area. So, this is not a league table of worst to best, but it does give us a sense of if we need to start somewhere, these are the areas where we've got the biggest risks and vulnerabilities that we should try to tackle first. These slides we looked at. We've tried to then put out population demographic type information that we pulled together. A lot of this is census data or local administrative data. It covers things like deprivation, it covers things like age, sex profile, it covers things about languages and how our residents want to be engaged with, because that's another key part, that there's no point in us sending out a load of broadcasts on social media about support if nobody is accessing digitally into services. We may need to do some door knocking or flyering or open events and other things within there. We've captured lots of information about housing, as I mentioned, so tenure type, energy classifications, average rents, household composition, and those type of things. Lots of information around employment and benefits. What does the profile of economically active look like? What do incomes look like? How many children are in poverty, fuel poverty, skills, all of the things that could give us levers to be able to sort of alleviate the challenges that we've got. And then we've got a series of local metrics within here that look at how does it feel to live in that area around sort of criminality, fly tipping, school attainment, those type of things. So a whole basket of metrics within there. Like I said, I'll skip over those. What we've then got are a series of sort of responses that we've started then to develop with our local teams and local partners. And this is just a flavour of some of the things that we're doing within the city. So we've set up a dedicated response hub, a hotline for people to phone into, and actually we can help navigate them to support and opportunities to sort of deal with any problems that they've got locally. Very much builds on what we put in place around COVID pandemic and sort of support during lockdowns at that time. We're looking at how we can navigate the sort of housing support fund programs around making sure that the funds are directed at the people where they need them most and will get the most benefit from those. We're looking at other local welfare provision. We've got a restart of our emergency food supply network, which again was part of the COVID response, to enable us to connect people to food banks and food banks to food suppliers and other things. And we've got a particular focus around health equality, as it says here, but overall equality. Is this being felt proportionally across all of our residents, or do we need to take into account that particular communities are feeling this in very different ways? And then there's a few others here around sort of how do we do comms and engagement that's accessible to all, as I touched on. How do we work with our schools to make sure, as we've described here, this poverty-proof school day? So we're doing a lot of work to look at vulnerable children or children from vulnerable households and that may need some support. We're working with our housing providers around what tenancy support they can offer. We're using our local infrastructure through our local network of neighbourhood teams and bringing together voluntary sector and public sector and everything in between. And we are coordinating all that through our teams around neighbourhoods. So the last bit of this really, I suppose, is where I started, was that I thought it was useful to bring something along here, not just to paint a really bleak picture and depress everybody, but to try and think about whether there was anything that we were missing, because I'm obviously aware that everybody were looking at this from different angles within their own businesses, within their own organisations and roles. And I suppose for us, it was just an opportunity of, are we missing something that is a key data set or a key piece of intelligence that you're aware of that would help us understand this better and actually plan forward? is there anything that you're doing in a very similar area that you think we could maybe connect up on, collaborate around? And that third bit around, is there any area that we think we should join forces on going forward? I'm happy for us to think about how we work with other organisations on common things, and take it from there. So that was a rapid overview. Like I say, I didn't really want to get into too much detail because I think the headlines are the headlines. I think it was more about a discussion on, does any of that make sense? Does any of that correlate with what you're doing locally? And any thoughts on what we should be doing now or next? So I shall stop and open up for any comments or questions.
Thanks, Paul. Ian? You're muted.
Always
You get it right,
always happens. Yeah, really interesting. So apology, I had to step out for a short while. Well, another reason why I was really interested is my son has recently joined Nottingham City Council, working in policy and performance. So yeah, we have conversations about similar things, actually. So in terms of what a couple of other things to try, maybe one of which we're sort of doing, and the other I've looked at but haven't done. So we're increasingly sort of using banking data to look at spending. Now we're pretty much only looking at it for grocery, but relatively small area stuff through time, and it's we essentially get probably about, through the source we're using, something like around 5% of spend, which we can then sort of scale up or just use as a barometer. And that was very interesting as we went through COVID, because we could see the shift to online, away from supermarkets. But I'm just kind of, one of the things I'm kind of thinking of might be useful for you is just to benchmark how much over time those communities are spending in supermarkets and discounters, and maybe how much that starts to trend down in some of the more challenged areas. That could be some, I mean, unfortunately it's commercial data, so it's going to cost you some money unless you can strike up a partnership, but that would, I think, be quite powerful in maybe in terms of not only analytics but advocacy as well.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good suggestion, and an area that we were talking about at one point, and I think we do need to come back to and have a look at. Like you say, that information is available commercially, and that might be useful for us to sort of try and tap into, and certainly for our tracking. I think this piece of work was to look at a sort of moment in time to just say this is it, but we are going to ultimately have to track how that changes over time. What gets worse, what gets better. And sort of try and understand that. So yeah, that's really good. Thanks.
The other one, which again I've kind of downloaded the data but not looked at, is there's a lot of sort of open data now, isn't there, on, I forget which government department it came from, but on home energy certificates. So actually looking at I mean, it's even down, I think it's down to UPRN level, I think, UPRN in address. So one of the things that we, like I say, we thought about but not really done anything about is just in terms of energy poverty, was trying to match a view of the household sort of household incomes, if you like, against what's the property people are living in, how energy efficient is it, or how energy inefficient is it.
We use a data set as part of the analysis, and it's in the slide pack. It's only a very small row when we did the analysis by ward, so we were trying to understand the same thing about fuel spend and how efficient the houses were, so we were trying to link that. But yeah, we can look into what you have just mentioned about looking into income and how we can link that with the energy efficiency of the homes. Something we can explore.
Because I think, I mean, I saw you got Experian sort of on some of the slides. I think, I mean, we don't use Experian, we use CACI, but it's in terms of the certainly the geodemographic mosaic versus Acorn, it's pretty similar. So, we use their pen portrait of a household balance sheet and income and things like that. But I'm also aware that that's a good representation of the ground truth, but it tends to average maybe a little bit too much. Yeah,
and I think that's a really good point across all three aspects there. That's the thing for us, that this is different for everybody, isn't it? It's different for every household. And I think some of the stuff the two examples I gave around, one extreme we've got larger families living in social housing compared to singles, or singles living in shared or single occupancy rented accommodation. In some ways, those in social housing could be protected more from the energy burden, because they tend to be more efficient, because the efficiency work's already been done, the maintenance has already been done. There's some safeguards, not perfect, but some elements within there. Those within the private rented sector, very little support that anybody apart from a well-meaning landlord can offer, in a sense, around that. And they'll be under some pressures themselves in terms of mortgage rate rises and other things within there. So I think anything that we can do to try and understand the different types of household is key. So I think that's really useful. Thanks.
and I guess, do you have sort of property or premise level information as to whether it's owner occupied or private rented, or socially rented?
Yeah, so we've got some data. It's imperfect, and we can only use it at certain levels. So some of it's collected for sort of council tax purposes. So in an administrative sense, the services know that, and on a case by case basis, we can get some profiles around that of how do we think that breaks down by area. But it's not perfect, 'cause it's not completely accurate. We don't always get notified if someone's a tenant or an owner, for example, because there's not always a benefit to that for people.
True.
Any questions, comments?
I was trying to rack my brain for anything I can add to the conversation, but I don't really have anything I can add from my sort of tenure in GSK. It's not really kind of that helpful. Honestly, kind of health is sort of the thing that would be the consequence of some of the cost of living, but that's a sort of kind of a slightly different take on it. I don't think I've got any experience of any data that would help you understand better what's going on in your area.
And I think that's come up as part of the sort of follow-up conversations that we've been having. We're doing a bit of work at the moment to identify GP practices where residents may be linked to, and then asking them to think about if they see an increase in health-related issues within those communities, then we can start to keep an eye on that sooner. There's lots of feedback we've had around that if people are forced to cut back on spending, they might not buy the prescription every month, which is devastating. If they ended up in that sense that you may be able to cope with that for a while, but the long-term health implications are not great, are they? Within there, and more subtly than that, there's a lot of conditions that rely on homes being warm and dry. And actually, if people are starting to live in colder, damper conditions for whatever reasons, that may exacerbate certainly some of the sort of respiratory type conditions that some people might have.
There is an aspect you could look at around the increased burden on the NHS from doing that, and actually the kind of the additional cost, because hospital stay is in the region of sort of like £11,000. Whereas a preventative action would be significantly cheaper than that per patient.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. And yeah, that's type of the sort of lobbying part that I suppose we're trying to make alongside this to say, yeah, you know, a short term saving here isn't cost effective over the longer period, and trying to work that through. I think, you know, the issue is we know that there are no perfect answers to this. You can't solve the whole solution, but how do we prioritize a bit better?
Yeah, we make respiratory products, and we're acutely aware that the conditions that people have that are taking our products are very sensitive to the weather. We see seasonality in the usage and the amount of product that we're selling and, you know, being prescribed. There is some seasonality to it, and yeah, if you just start then throwing in missing out, taking it, and bad living conditions, it's going to be bad for people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Have you looked at any of the dispensing and prescribing and dispensing open data, Paul?
We haven't at the minute. That's a good point.
Because I haven't looked at it for a while, but I know that there's a lot of detail in terms of GP prescribing. So you could probably, you know, with a bit of expert help, pick out, you know, respiratory prescribing products, for instance. You can also, in terms of pharmacies, pick up the level of sort of, you know, I think it's by month, but the level of dispensing through each pharmacy over time.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. I think literally only yesterday we started to kick off some work with our population health team, and that's where that GP surgery type analysis has started to come in. Again, I think we could pose that back to them and say, how do we build that into a more regular sort of monitor to understand whether there are changing patterns there as well.
I'm kind of interested in how much this the energy crisis on the back of COVID is this, have these two things sort of forever changed how you're going to work and approach this, you know, in terms of this window on the lives of your population?
Yeah, so I think pre-pandemic we'd already started, like most local authorities, we'd already started to move to a more locality-based model, which was around bringing together agencies at much smaller geographies to discuss what was happening within their areas. So, you know, having that finger on the pulse a bit more so than, you know, just a national data set or a citywide data set. So we had moved to that, and that, you know, if there was ever a good place, there wasn't really in this, but we were in a better place, I suppose, when the pandemic hit, to be able to respond to some of that. And I think this has just reinforced the fact that we took lots of lessons from pandemic, that there are some things that we need to continue with. So, you know, food poverty wasn't a new thing. Food poverty has existed for a decade, if not longer. It just highlighted actually there are things that we could do to support the mechanics around how do we support people who are in that position. You know, you can't fix the problem, but you can support the issues around it. And I think this has stepped it up a level. The key thing here is that I suppose the individuals that we were supporting and, you know, being the most vulnerable were fairly static for a long period of time. The latest cost of living crisis has dragged in a whole different cohort who have never interacted with public services or other services before, because, you know, they've coped, they've been just above that threshold, and now we've got a whole number of households that have been dragged into it. So there's learning that we need to do around that, around how do we evolve our offer to work with individuals and households that we've never spoken to before, and redirect our services around that. We've certainly been pretty good for a while on sort of trying to use a data and evidence-led approach to our decision making. So the wider work of my service do a lot of work with individual services within the council to look at the way they deliver and what they do, and we sort of do some of the I suppose the process mapping, process evaluation type pieces, and then put recommendations forward on how you could evolve and improve and adjust those to meet changing needs and requirements. So we've been pretty good at that for a while. But yeah, this has just stepped it up and put it into focus, but also become quite challenging.
Yeah.
Just my 2 pence on some points that both Ian and Mark made. I'm a member of the patient participation group in my village.
Yeah.
Our surgery costs have gone up; they've tripled. So they're finding ways of cutting back on heating and lighting. It's affecting the mental health of the staff there. They're having more sickness days. They're less able to provide the appointments that people need. People are complaining about the surgery. There's a chance our surgery may close because of poor service. That will impact on people having to travel further to get an appointment when there's no bus service on a Sunday and it's a 2-hour service. The knock-on effect is it goes right the way down to absolutely everyone. And then you've got another knock-on effect and another one, and the ripples just keep going.
Yeah.
And it's absolutely awful.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think some of the bits that I suppose we've been able to do less on as an organisation, but we have been working with others. Is that I suppose that business impacts, whether that's a GP as a business or whether it's the local store or whatever that might be. Those cost pressures mean that some of those things will change and maybe disappear. And actually, what does that then mean? Then create a
It's a huge impact, especially on small communities that rely on local amenities. I was just wondering whether you'd heard of energy champions.
I'm not sure. I don't
They
think
are
so.
they're part of BENCOMs, the community benefit societies.
Okay.
And they are going out into the community, offering help on how to save energy, how to save costs. Whether it may involve a cost to save that, or it might be just insulating windows and stuff.
Yeah.
But that could provide information on the who and the where if you made contact with those organisations.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
Just a thought that won't necessarily be on your radar unless you know about them, but they will have information that you might be able to use about areas that you're not connecting with at the minute.
Yeah, and we've got a local sort of response coordination team that are trying to sort of pick up ideas, suggestions, pieces of things to follow up on, so we can feed that into that group. Because if they may know about it somewhere in that mix, but if they don't, it's really useful for us to just flag anything.
Well, the community energy companies actually find places to put panels up, and the excess energy goes back to the community.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
So ultimately, it does save. It's not going to happen tomorrow, and it's probably not going to help people this year, but it certainly won't. But those organisations are there, and they're doing things with people that you might not necessarily be connecting with. Any other comments, offers?
I suppose the only final one for me is whether you've got, whether you can call on any of your, academic colleagues to do research for you, to co-opt them in on some of these things.
Yeah, so we're doing some work specifically with University of Manchester, where we've got some joint up projects there, and we've got some connections into some of the universities locally and beyond as well that we're exploring different bits. We don't know all the answers on this. We can't resource finding all the answers on it. So we do need that network, which is, as I say, part of the reason why I wanted to just reach out to the group here in case there's anything that, have you thought about this? Here's an amazing bit of intelligence or analytics that you haven't thought about. But likewise, just try and build networks up to connect in. That's great. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, really interesting. Thank you both.
Yeah.
We'll move on to my bit, which is pretty much Doug housekeeping. So you're welcome to stay, but
I'll drop off if that's okay, because I've got to travel into the office. So that's fine.
Thank you very much.